Chimamanda Adichie nació el 15 de septiembre de 1977 en Enugu, Nigeria. A la edad de 19 años, se fue a Estados Unidos y estudió comunicación en la Universidad Drexel en Filadelfia por 2 años, hasta obtener su título en Comunicación y Ciencias Políticas en la Universidad Estatal de Connecticut. En 2001, completó un máster de escritura creativa en la Universidad de Johns Hopkins en Baltimore y un máster de estudios africanos en Yale. Después, comienza a hacer novelas y recibe varios premios. Además, en la actualidad imparte talleres de escritura en Nigeria y en Estados Unidos. A lo largo de su vida, comienza a difundir su historia acerca del peligro que tiene contar una sola historia, en donde expresa cuán vulnerables e influenciables son las personas ante una historia.
I'm a storyteller and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. Now things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized.
Claude Lévi-Strauss fue un antropólogo francés que nació en 1908 en Bruselas, Bélgica, y murió en el 2009 en París, Francia. Fue el que introdujo el enfoque estructuralista en las ciencias sociales, y fue de hecho el fundador de la antropología estructural, la cual tiene un método basado en la lingüística homónima creada por Saussure y desarrollada por el formalismo ruso. Dado el peso de su obra, dentro y fuera de la antropología, fue uno de los intelectuales más influyentes del siglo XX. Sus teorías exponen a la antropología estructural, la cual aplica el método estructural en las ciencias sociales, y el cual dice que un auténtico análisis científico debe de ser explicativo. Lévi-Strauss afirma que las diferentes culturas de los seres humanos, sus conductas, esquemas lingüísticos y mitos revelan la existencia de patrones comunes a toda la vida humana. Gracias a él, hoy se tiende a rechazar los enfoques etnocentristas, los cuales tienen un punto de vista en el que se analiza el mundo de acuerdo con los parámetros de la cultura propia. Claude Lévi-Strauss tiende a dividir los procesos psíquicos y culturales en la superestructura, en la que el estructuralismo aparece por deducción o por inducción, llevándolo a una postura casi metafísica.
Chimamanda Adichie, El peligro de una sola historia, expone la realidad en la que vivimos hoy en día, gracias a los medios de comunicación, como la televisión, los libros, periódicos o incluso las redes sociales, que se utilizan cada vez más por miles de personas en el mundo, ya que logran causar estereotipos o simplemente una imagen tergiversada de la realidad de cada cultura. Pues como dice una frase, no todo es lo que parece. A veces las personas vemos o escuchamos cosas dentro de esos medios o nos enteramos por alguien ajeno y solo por el hecho de verlo o escucharlo, lo adoptamos como una realidad, siendo que puede ser solo una parte de la verdadera historia. Este es un problema que la sociedad aborda, ya que esos estereotipos son los significados que son atribuidos por dicha sociedad. Debemos aprender a conocer todo lo que leemos, vemos o escuchamos a fondo, para no tener una idea cerrada de algo. Es importante tener variedad de la información, estar al pendiente de más cosas y no solo de lo que nos interesa o rodea, ver más allá de lo que se conoce para poder ser sabio realmente. Esto ayudaría a crear menos racismo y discriminación entre las culturas, pues no porque sean diferentes significa que sean malas. Al contrario, pueden parecerse en algunas cosas o incluso tener cosas interesantes. Por medio del método estructuralista del que habla Strauss, se busca identificar el problema, que en este caso son los medios masivos de comunicación, que crean los hechos sociales, los cuales son los estereotipos o las ideas que las personas realizan. Analizar es importante para establecer entre esas ideas las correlaciones que tienen en todo su contexto. Una realidad social es que juzgamos sin conocer.
So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this. She had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner.
Nigeria es un país situado en África Occidental en la zona del Golfo de Guinea. Es considerado uno de los países más pobres del continente africano. La pobreza, el hambre, la violencia, las migraciones y entre otras cosas siguen sumiendo al pueblo de Nigeria en la más dura de las miserias. Las consecuencias directas de la falta de agua ha sido la destrucción de las cosechas y la muerte de muchas cabezas de ganado. Esto ha implementado la falta de cultivos y la falta de alimentos en el país. Nigeria es visto como uno de los países más pobres de todos los continentes del mundo.
I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West. a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Okoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives.
Sin embargo, esa no es la única historia de Nigeria. Desde los años 60 fue descubierto el petróleo y la economía de Nigeria cambió de ser agrícola a ser industrial. Hoy día, Nigeria es uno de los mayores exportadores de petróleo, agricultura y ganadería en el mundo. Es por eso que Nigeria no puede quedar en una sola historia, en la historia que el mundo sabe.
All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. That when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.